Hey guys, tonight we settle ourselves down, letting the busy world outside turn into a soft blur, and we ease gently into the dry, sun-baked landscape of ancient Egypt. You feel the slow, steady air, heavy with the scent of resins, dust, and the distant, cooling waters of the great Nile. You are here, standing softly on warm sand, watching the immense, silent preparations for the journey to the afterlife. It is a time when life itself, for the Egyptians, felt less like a fleeting moment and more like a gentle pause before a grand, eternal continuation. You might be lying in your cozy bed right now, maybe a little too warm, or maybe just perfectly nestled under your blanket, and you probably believe that your brain, that wrinkly, soft mass inside your skull, is the absolute command center for everything you are. Your memories, your strange little jokes, your ability to decide if you want one more sip of water. That is modern common sense, right? A fact so settled it is almost boring. But here, thousands of years ago, in the shadow of rising pyramids, and alongside the quiet banks of the Nile, they decided something completely different. They believed that gray matter was just useful filler, nothing more than a sort of internal padding, possibly a place for cooling the body. Certainly not the seat of your soul, or the engine of your incredible thoughts. It just did not matter to them. Before you get too comfortable, and possibly fall asleep halfway through, tap like and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy this odd mix of boredom and history. It keeps the channel alive, and the stories just sleepy enough to help you drift off again next time. Take a moment to post your location and local time, letting the gentle, shared quiet of this moment connect us all before we sink fully into the past. Now dim the lights, let the world outside grow quiet, and turn on a fan if you like that soft, steady hum in the background. Let your shoulders loosen and your breathing slow. This is your time to drift. No rush, no deadlines, no noise. Just you, a little warmth in the air, and the faint whisper of history waiting to unfold. So, settle in, and let's ease gently into tonight's journey together. You stand by the embalmer's table, your presence unnoticed, a gentle observer in a warm, dimly lit workshop. The air is thick, not with fear, but with a practical, almost tedious solemnity. This process of mummification is not something rushed. It is an extended ritual, taking many weeks, an incredible commitment of time and resource meant to ensure the deceased can truly live again. You watch the busy hands of the wetiyu, the professional embalmers, moving with an almost mechanical precision born of long practice. Their work is a highly specialized craft, often passed down through families, and it is considered necessary and deeply respectful, even if some of the steps are a bit messy by our own modern standards. They treat the body not as a discarded shell, but as a vessel being meticulously prepared for its next great voyage. You observe the tools laid out: bronze implements, long, thin hooks, jars of natron salt, linen strips by the mile, and sweet-smelling spices brought from distant lands. It is a slow, careful disassembly and preservation, driven by a profound spiritual need. The ancient Egyptians had a very practical, concrete view of the afterlife. It was not a foggy heaven. It was a physical place the spirit would travel to, and it needed a recognizable, preserved body to return to and inhabit. Without that body, the soul would be lost, condemned to wander aimlessly in the cosmic night. This central belief, the absolute necessity of the body, dictates everything that follows. It is the reason for the whole elaborate, lengthy endeavor you are now observing. Your eyes drift toward the head of the body, wrapped slightly in the initial stage. You know what is coming next, or rather, what is not coming next, in terms of reverence. The Egyptians are masters of anatomy in a way, but only through the necessity of death preparation. They know where every major organ is, where the veins run, and how to best preserve the flesh. Yet, their knowledge of function is deeply intertwined with their spiritual beliefs, and the function they assign to the brain is almost non-existent. You watch as a slender, hooked instrument is gently inserted through the nostril. This is the simple, direct, and slightly unsettling way they dealt with the brain. The quickest path to get it out. There is no ceremony for the removal of the brain. No hymns are chanted specifically for its extraction. The heart, as you will soon observe, is treated with immense, delicate care. The stomach, the lungs, the liver, and the intestines are all removed, meticulously cleaned, dried, and placed into dedicated, decorative canopic jars, each protected by the 4 sons of Horus. But the brain, it is simply churned, pulled out in pieces through the nose, and then either discarded with the waste material or sometimes just poured away with the flushing liquid. It is given no special container, no prayer, no promise of resurrection. It is treated as little better than biological clutter. You can almost feel the lack of importance it holds to the busy embalmer. Just another thing to get rid of so the body can dry out properly. Imagine that for a moment. If you were packing the essentials for a long trip, say a quiet vacation into the stars, you would pack your identification, your favorite book, and perhaps a warm sweater. You would certainly not throw away the whole luggage. For the Egyptians, the brain was the empty shopping bag, not the valuable contents. It was the thing that you did not need to carry into eternity. That is the kind of profound indifference that you feel radiating from the atmosphere here. You might chuckle softly at the historical irony. The seat of all this complex philosophy, the thing that figured out astronomy, architecture, and mathematics, is treated like spoiled milk. This process itself, this physical proof of how the Egyptians saw the brain, is a foundational piece of knowledge that has survived. It is not just an idea, it is a mainstream historical fact, repeated in ancient texts like the Greek historian Herodotus's accounts, who described the embalming process you are now watching. He confirmed this casual, almost disdainful removal of the brain. You stand there, a silent witness to this vast, ancient oversight, feeling the weight of the ages pressing down on this simple, disposable object. You might wonder why they did not even bother to save it. After all, they saved everything else. The reason is simple and beautifully centered on another organ, the heart. In Egyptian understanding, the heart was the source of life, intellect, memory, and personality. When the deceased arrived in the Hall of Two Truths for the final judgment, it was the heart, specifically the IBU, which was weighed against the feather of Maiwadiat, the concept of truth and cosmic order. The heart was the physical record of the person's entire moral life. If you had a good heart, the scales balanced. If not, well, the terrible crocodile-headed demon Amit was waiting nearby for a quick snack. No one, absolutely no one, ever suggested weighing the brain. That would have been absurd to them. The brain recorded nothing of value. It was inert matter. The physical reality of this indifference is stunning. Think of the delicate nature of the brain. It is so soft, so easily damaged, yet it holds everything you are. The Egyptians knew how to build structures that would last millennia. They knew how to preserve flesh for the same length of time. But when they looked at the brain, they saw only a cold, wet, useless substance. It simply did not seem to perform any noticeable, vital function. If you touched it, it felt like cold sludge. If you removed it, the person was already deceased. So no difference in behavior was noted. It did not bleed dramatically like the major vessels near the heart. It just sat there, waiting to be scraped out. This practical observation likely reinforced their spiritual belief that its function was minimal. There is a quirky or fringe tidbit related to this. While the brain was usually discarded, historians still argue whether there were ever extremely rare instances where embalmers attempted some form of preservation for the brain, perhaps in a very late period or for an extraordinarily important person, like a pharaoh. The consensus is overwhelmingly that they did not, but the possibility exists that a few experimental embalmers working on the side might have tried to dry or treat it, just in case. But if they did, the practice certainly never stuck, and the vast majority of skulls found are completely empty, save for a few stray remnants of the draining fluids. It remains a fascinating what if. In the study of Egyptian funeral practices, a small whisper of doubt in the historical record. You take a slow, deep breath, letting the aroma of spices and old linen fill your lungs. You watch as the workers turn their attention to the internal organs, treating them with the utmost seriousness. Here, the process slows. The viscera are not merely thrown away. They are carefully tended to. The stomach is a key part of digestion. The lungs are key to breath. And the liver and intestines all have a visible, tactile function in life. You can see how one might associate a physical, working organ with the force of life itself. But the brain? It sits silently, doing its work without any visible motion, any tangible movement that would suggest its incredible power. If you cannot see it working, they seem to reason. Is it really doing anything important? The embalmer now begins the meticulous drying process, covering the body completely in natron salt. This is a naturally occurring salt mixture found in the dry lake beds near the Nile, and it is a powerful desiccant. The salt will gently, slowly pull the moisture from the tissues over many weeks. The removal of the wet, spongy brain is crucial for this step. If they left it in, it would simply rot, creating an internal mess that would compromise the entire preparation. So, the removal, though dismissive of the brain's function, is actually a necessary technical step for successful preservation. It is treated as an obstacle to mummification, not as a core part of the person being preserved. The entire body must become dry and eternal, and the wet brain stands in the way of that perfection. You feel a wave of gentle quiet settle over the workshop as the natron is applied. It is a moment of waiting, of pause. The body rests encased in salt, beginning its slow transformation. You imagine the deceased, their memory now entirely relocated to their untouched, still seated heart. Their dreams, their fears, their vast knowledge of the river and the stars, all are held in the muscular pump in their chest. The head is just a stable foundation for the face, the container for the eyes, the mechanism for hearing. The thing that we consider the central processing unit is seen here as merely ballast. Historians still argue whether the Egyptians noticed or recorded any functional connection between brain injury and physical or mental change. We know that later medical texts, which you will glimpse soon, show some awareness, but it is clear that even if they noticed a correlation, a blow to the head causing a limp, for example, they failed to connect that physical observation to the spiritual and intellectual center of the person. They might have thought a brain injury caused damage to the vessels or the muscles, but never that it damaged the part of you that makes you you. The spiritual model was simply too strong. The heart model won. The quiet, almost mesmerizing rhythm of the embalming process continues, slowly and without hurry. The linens are stacked, waiting for the final stage. The canopic jars, waiting for their contents, sit polished and ready. Everything here speaks of preparation for immortality, but with one massive, sleepy blind spot. The greatest thinkers, the priests, the scholars of ancient Egypt, simply missed the boat on the brain. They were too busy focusing on the dramatic, beating, emotional heart. And as you wait, feeling the dry, soft air of the desert night press in, you begin to understand why that oversight felt so natural and necessary to them. It made the entire, complex system of judgment and afterlife make perfect sense. If your soul is in your heart, why bother saving the messy, cold, and quiet material in your skull? You drift, watching the shadows lengthen, waiting for the return of the embalmers to complete their slow, important work. The silence of the night is broken only by the soft, steady scratch of the desert wind against the stone walls of the workshop. Everything is calm. Everything is settled. You turn your gaze gently away from the empty, quiet cavity of the skull and look lower, toward the center of the chest, where the ancient Egyptians believed the true universe of the human experience resided. If the head was a silent, cold attic, the chest was the warm, rhythmic hearth that kept the entire house warm. You can imagine the feeling of your own heartbeat right now. That steady, reassuring thrum against your ribs, a constant companion that speeds up when you run and slows down when you drift towards sleep. To the people of the Nile, this was not just a pump moving blood, it was the absolute monarch of the body, the throne of the soul, and the singular driver of every thought you have ever had. You are witnessing the rise of the heart, or the eve, as the supreme ruler of existence. In this dry, preserving air of the embalming workshop, the reverence for the heart is almost palpable. While the brain was unceremoniously hooked out and discarded, the heart is treated with the kind of respect usually reserved for pharaohs and gods. It is the only organ that the embalmers are strictly instructed to leave in place. If they accidentally sever it or damage it during the removal of the other organs, it is a spiritual catastrophe of the highest order. Without the heart, there is no you. There is no memory of your mother's face, no recollection of the taste of honey, no ability to speak your name to the gods. You would simply cease to exist in any meaningful way. It is easy to understand why they felt this way if you simply close your eyes and pay attention to your body. When you feel a surge of intense emotion, fear, love, anger, where do you feel it? You do not feel a twitch in your forehead or a throb in your temples. You feel a tightness in your chest, a fluttering of the heart, a physical ache in the core of your torso. To an ancient observer, Relying on direct sensory experience, the evidence was overwhelming. The heart reacts to the world. It dances when you are happy and sinks when you are sad. The brain, by comparison, sits in stoic, unresponsive silence. It feels logical, then, that the organ doing all the reacting must be the one doing all the thinking. This belief went far beyond simple emotion. The Egyptians developed a complex physiological concept involving the metu, a network of vessels and channels that they believed originated from the heart and spread to every limb and orifice of the body. You can picture these metu like the irrigation canals that spread the life, giving waters of the Nile into the dry desert fields. In their view, these channels carried not just blood, but air, tears, saliva, mucus, urine, and even the breath of life itself. The heart was the central hub, the grand engineer controlling the flow of all these vital substances. If your eyes watered, it was because the heart sent tears through the vessels to the eyes. If you heard a beautiful song, the sound traveled down the vessels from your ears directly into your heart, where it was understood and appreciated. The ears were merely funnels, the heart was the listener. You might find it strange to think of doing mathematics with your heart, but for an Egyptian scribe, that is exactly how it worked. When they calculated the grain harvest or the angle of a pyramid slope, they believed the numbers were being crunched in the ventricles of their heart. Intelligence, or sia, was a cardiac function. To know something by heart is a phrase we still use today, a lingering, poetic fossil of this ancient certainty. For them, it was literal. If you were forgetful, it was because your heart was tired or the vessels were blocked. If you were wise, it was because your heart was wide and open. The brain was not even a backup hard drive, it was just packing material for the skull. Historians still argue whether the Egyptians made a strict distinction between the Haiti, the physical, biological heart, and the Ebe, the metaphysical, spiritual heart, or if they viewed them as one seamless, magical entity. Some texts suggest the Haiti was the flesh and blood organ that could become diseased, while the Ebe was the immortal aspect that traveled to the afterlife. However, in the dim light of the tomb, these distinctions blur. The physical preservation of the Haiti was absolutely essential for the survival of the Ibe. You cannot have the ghost without the machine. This is why the embalmers you are watching are so incredibly careful around the chest cavity. They work with a surgical tenderness, ensuring the heart remains tethered, undisturbed, resting in its natural cradle. There is a fascinating, slightly quirky tidbit about what happened when things went wrong. Even the best embalmers sometimes made mistakes, or perhaps the heart was too diseased or damaged in life to be preserved. In these cases, the Egyptians had a magical contingency plan, the heart scarab. You might see these beautiful, beetle-shaped amulets in museums, often carved from green stone like jasper or serpentine, meant to symbolize regeneration and rebirth. If the physical heart was lost or destroyed, a heart scarab would be placed over the chest of the mummy. It wasn't just jewelry, it was a replacement part, a spiritual prosthetic. The amulet was inscribed with a specific spell, Chapter 30b from the Book of the Dead, which effectively rebooted the system, acting as a stand in heart so the soul wouldn't show up to the afterlife empty-handed. You can imagine the relief of the family, placing that green stone beetle on the chest of their loved one, knowing that even though the biological heart had failed. The magical backup was securely in place. It speaks to a profound anxiety about the completeness of the body. They needed to be whole. The idea of arriving in the field of reeds, the Egyptian paradise, without a heart was a fate worse than death. It meant total oblivion. It meant you could not be judged, and therefore you could not be saved. This brings you to the most critical reason for the heart's supremacy: the weighing of the heart ceremony. This is the central drama of Egyptian mythology, the moment toward which all life navigates. You can picture the scene in the Hall of Two Truths. The deceased stands trembling before the great scales. On one side, the feather of Ma'at, a delicate ostrich plume representing truth, justice, balance, and cosmic order. On the other side, the heavy, fleshy heart of the deceased. This is not a metaphor. They believed the heart contained a physical record of every action taken in life. Every lie told, every loaf of bread stolen, every act of kindness. It all added weight or lightness to the organ. You watch the jackal-headed god Anubis adjusting the plummet of the scale, checking the balance with intense precision. The ibis-headed god Thoth stands ready with his reed brush and palette to record the result. And waiting in the shadows, sitting on her haunches, is Amit the devourer, a terrifying hybrid with the head of a crocodile, the forequarters of a lion, and the hindquarters of a hippopotamus. Amit is not there for conversation. She is the cosmic garbage disposal. If the heart is heavy with sin and outweighs the feather, Amit eats the heart right then and there. The soul is instantly annihilated. The brain is never consulted in this trial. The brain is not on the witness stand. It is the heart that holds the moral responsibility for the entire life lived. This immense spiritual pressure placed on the heart led to a very specific relationship between the Egyptian and their own internal organ. They actually feared their heart might betray them. The inscription on the heart scarab you looked at earlier often included a plea. "O my heart of my mother! O my heart of my different forms! Do not stand up as a witness against me! Do not be opposed to me in the tribunal." You can sense the desperation in those words. It is like begging your own diary not to read itself aloud in court. They believed the heart had a mind of its own, an independent consciousness that could choose to rat them out to Osiris even if they tried to lie. The brain was obedient and silent, but the heart was a separate, powerful entity living inside the chest. As you stand in the quiet workshop, the embalmers are now finishing the treatment of the chest cavity. They pack the space around the heart with linen sachets filled with natron and aromatic sawdust, creating a cozy, dry cushion for the precious organ. They want it to be comfortable. They want it to last forever. You might notice that they also pay attention to the left side of the body, often making the incision for organ removal on the left flank. This is likely because the heart tilts slightly to the left, and entering from that side gives them the best access to the other organs, while allowing them to protect the heart's position. Every cut, every movement is choreographed around the safety of that single, beating drum. The connection between the heart and the breath was also vital. The Egyptians noticed that when the heart stopped, the breath stopped. The two were inextricably linked in a cycle of life. They did not know about oxygenation in the modern chemical sense, but they understood that the breath of life entered the nose, went down to the lungs, and was then embraced by the heart to be distributed. The brain, sitting up there in the skull, seemed disconnected from this vital loop. It was physically close to the nose, yes, but it didn't seem to do anything with the air. It just sat there. The heart, however, was clearly the engine that accepted the fuel of the air and pushed it through the body. You might find it soothing to realize that, in a way, we have never really let go of this Egyptian idea. When you tell someone you love them with all your heart, you are speaking ancient Egyptian. When you say someone is heartless, you are invoking the threat of Amit. We know scientifically that the brain controls these emotions, yet we culturally refuse to give the brain the credit. We don't say, "I love you with all my hypothalamus." It doesn't have the same warmth, the same rhythmic resonance. The Egyptians just took this poetic truth and made it their literal, medical reality. They built their entire civilization around the feeling in their chest. The air in the room seems to grow heavier, warmer, as if the collective heartbeat of the history you are witnessing is filling the space. You can visualize the two vessels radiating out from the mummified heart, invisible lines of energy connecting the deceased to the world of the living and the dead. The heart is prepared now. It has been washed, anointed with oils that smell of cedar and myrrh, and blessed by the priests. It is ready for the long silence of the tomb, waiting for the moment it will be called upon to testify. One mainstream historical fact that anchors this belief is the medical writings found in the Ebers Papyrus. This massive scroll, one of the oldest medical texts in existence, contains a treatise on the heart and its vessels. It describes the heart as the center of the body's blood supply, stating, "There are vessels from it to every limb. As for everything on which the physician lays his hands, he feels something of the heart." They recognized the pulse. They knew that checking the pulse in the wrist or neck was a way to listen to the heart's messages. This diagnostic ability, the realization that the heart's rhythm told the story of the body's health, cemented its status as the supreme commander. If the brain had a pulse, perhaps history would have been different. But the brain has no beat, and so it had no authority. You gaze at the linen strips now, being prepared for the wrapping. Even the wrapping pattern will respect the chest. Amulets will be placed within the layers of bandages specifically to protect the heart. The Djed pillar for stability. The Tayet knot of Isis for protection. The head will get a nice mask, certainly, but the chest gets the spiritual armor. The priorities are clear. The head is the face of the individual, but the chest is the engine of their eternity. As the resin is poured, sealing the body's preparation, you think about the silence of the brain versus the noise of the heart. The brain operates in secrecy, firing neurons in darkness, doing its work without fanfare. The heart is loud. It announces its presence every second of every day. It demands attention. For a culture that loved grand monuments, giant statues and loud processions, the subtle, quiet brain simply didn't fit the aesthetic. They liked things big, bold, and central. The heart is the pyramid of the human body, central, solid, and pointing toward the divine. There is a gentle irony in the fact that it required the brain to formulate the complex theology that stripped the brain of its power. The Egyptian priests used their frontal lobes to create the myth of the heart's supremacy. They used their visual cortex to design the heart scarabs. They used their language centers to write the book of the dead. The brain, in a supreme act of humility, wrote itself out of the script. It worked tirelessly to elevate the heart, content to remain the anonymous ghostwriter of human history. You feel the weight of this ancient perspective settling over you, a warm blanket of certainty. There is something restful about it. You don't have to worry about your racing thoughts, your anxieties, your overactive mind. According to the Egyptians, those are just ripples in the heart's vessels. If you can calm your heart, you can calm your soul. You take a deep breath, feeling your own chest rise and fall, aligning yourself with the rhythm of the millions of people who lived and died along the Nile, all of them trusting their hearts to guide them through the dark. The workshop grows darker now, the shadows stretching long across the sandy floor. The heart is safe. The body is ready. The focus shifts away from the internal organs, which are now secured for eternity, and toward the external shell. But the silence of the rejected brain still lingers in the corner of the room, a discarded mystery that will not be solved for thousands of years. You watch the dust motes dance in the last beams of light, drifting slowly, aimlessly, much like the forgotten thoughts of a mind that was told it didn't matter. You stand now in the quiet, dusty corner of the Waybit, the place of purification, where the air is thick with the metallic tang of bronze and the sharp, biting scent of palm wine used for washing. The grand, spiritual reverence for the heart has faded slightly into the background, replaced by the grim, wet reality of the embalmer's most technical challenge. You are about to witness the moment where theology meets biology in a very messy way. You watch as the head embalmer, a man with hands stained by years of working with resins and oils, picks up a long, slender tool. It is about the length of your forearm, made of bronze, and it curves slightly at the end into a sharp, hooked point. This is the brain hook. It is not a surgical instrument designed for healing. It is a tool designed for excavation. You might want to take a slow, deep breath through your nose right now, just to appreciate that you can. For the person lying on the limestone table, the nose is about to become the primary work site. The Egyptians, in their quest to preserve the head, without cutting it open and ruining the face, had to find a way to get the brain out without smashing the skull. They couldn't just saw the top off. The deceased needed to look like themselves for the afterlife. So, they found a back door, or rather, a front door that was usually exit only. The nostrils. You watch as the embalmer steadies the head. There is no prayer whispered here, no incense burned specifically for this moment. It is purely a demolition job. He inserts the bronze hook up the left nostril. You can almost feel the phantom pressure of it. He pushes it past the nasal cavity until he hits the ethmoid bone, the thin, sieve-like plate of bone that separates the nose from the brain. With a practiced, sharp tap, often using a small mallet or just the force of his hand, he breaks through the bone. Crack. It is a small sound, barely audible over the bustle of the workshop, but it marks the breach of the cranial fortress. Now, the real work begins. The hook is pushed deeper into the cranial cavity. The goal is not to pull the brain out in one piece. That would be impossible through such a small hole. Instead, the embalmer begins to whisk. Yes, whisk. He rotates the tool vigorously, churning the soft tissue of the brain into a semi-liquid pulp. It is a crude, violent motion. completely at odds with the delicate painting of coffins or the weaving of fine linen. It is the industrial side of immortality. You can imagine the sound, a wet, squelching noise that no one in the room pays any mind to. It is just part of the job, like a baker kneading dough or a potter wedging clay. Once the brain matter is sufficiently liquefied, the body is turned over, face down onto the table. Gravity does the rest. You watch as the dissolved brain material drains out of the nostrils, a thick, pinkish sludge pooling into a bowl placed below the head. It is a stark, unromantic image. This substance, which we now know contained the memories of a first kiss, the knowledge of how to build a chariot, the fear of lions, and the love of children, is pouring out like waste water. The Egyptians looked at this slurry and saw nothing of value. It was just cranial filling, a byproduct of the body that had to be removed to prevent rot. Historians still argue whether the brain was always removed, or if this was a luxury reserved only for the wealthy. The process you are watching, the hook, the breaking of the bone, was time-consuming and required a skilled specialist. It is likely that for the common farmer or laborer, the brain was simply left in place to dry out or rot naturally. But for the elite, for the people who could afford the deluxe package of mummification, the brain had to go. It is a strange irony that the more money you had, the less brain you got to keep in your skull. You might be wondering what happens to the sludge in the bowl. Is it saved? Is it buried with the body? Usually no. Unlike the liver or lungs, which are carefully washed and stored in alabaster jars, the brain material is often just thrown away. Sometimes it might be buried in the sand near the tomb, simply because it is biological material, but it is given no marker, no name, no jar. It is treated with the same level of ceremony as the sawdust swept from the floor. However, the hook method wasn't the only way. You notice another embalmer working on a different body nearby. He is using a different technique, perhaps for a slightly less wealthy client, or simply because of a different regional style. Instead of the hook, he is using a solvent. He pours a corrosive liquid, often a mixture of cedar oil and turpentine, into the skull through the nose or sometimes through the ear. Then he plugs the orifices with linen and wax. The body is left to sit for days. The strong oils eat away at the brain tissue, dissolving it chemically. When they return later and unplug the nose, the liquefied brain simply runs out, leaving the skull empty and clean. It is a no-touch method, efficient and brutal in its chemistry. There is a quirky or fringe tidbit that sometimes pops up in the archaeological record occasionally. The embalmers made a mistake and left the tool inside. You can picture the scene. A busy afternoon in the workshop, a distracted worker, a sudden distraction. Snap! The bronze hook breaks off inside the skull. Or perhaps he just drops it in and can't fish it out. Modern CT scans of mummies have revealed several instances where pieces of the brain removal tools are still rattling around inside the cranial cavity. It is a permanent, accidental souvenir of the clumsy procedure, locked away for thousands of years. It certainly suggests that the reverence for the body had its limits when it came to the practical difficulties of the job. Once the skull is drained, it is not left empty. You watch as the embalmers prepare a mixture of tree resins, beeswax, and aromatic spices. They need to fill the void. If the skull is left empty, it might collapse or crack over time. Also, They want to sterilize the inside to prevent any bacteria from undoing their work. So, they pour the hot, liquid resin into the skull, again through the nose. They tilt the head back and forth, swirling the resin around to coat the inner surface. It is like glazing the inside of a pot. Sometimes, they pack the skull with linen strips soaked in resin. You can see the embalmer using a long rod to stuff yard after yard of linen up the nostril, packing it tight into the space where the frontal lobes used to be. It is a tedious process, stuffing the head like a pillow. The goal is to restore the shape, to make the head feel solid and heavy again. They want the deceased to feel substantial in the afterlife, but they are replacing the neural network with rags and sap. They are swapping the biological computer for sawdust and glue. The sheer physicality of this section of the process is grounding. It reminds you that for all the gold masks and mystical spells, mummification was a dirty, difficult trade. It smelled. It attracted flies. It required physical strength to turn the bodies and crack the bones. The people doing this were not high priests in clean white robes chanting softly. They were laborers, craftsmen, effectively butchers of the dead, working in the heat of the Egyptian day. They were sweating. They were probably chatting about their wages or the river levels while they scooped out a brain. The mundane nature of the act reinforces just how little mystical value they placed on the organ. You don't chat about the weather while handling the Holy Heart. You chat while handling the garbage. You might notice that the face of the deceased sometimes looks a bit distorted during this process. The breaking of the ethmoid bone can sometimes cause the nose to collapse slightly, which is why they have to pack it so carefully afterwards. They are essentially reconstructing the face from the inside out. You see an embalmer carefully molding the nose back into shape, pressing the cartilage, ensuring the profile remains noble and recognizable. They care deeply about the appearance of the head, just not the contents. The face is the identity, the brain is just the stuffing. There is a mainstream historical fact that supports this observation: the examination of the mummy of King Tutankhamun. When his body was X-rayed and scanned, researchers found that his brain had been removed, and the skull cavity was filled with resin, which had pooled at the back of the head as it solidified. This confirms that even for a pharaoh, a living god on earth, the brain was not considered worth saving. He got the gold mask, the chariots, the furniture, and the food for the afterlife, but his brain was hooked out, just like everyone else's. The consistency of the practice across social strata, for those who could afford mummification, is a testament to the strength of the belief. As you watch the resin being poured, you catch the scent of it. A sharp, piney smell that cuts through the musty odor of the workshop. It is a clean smell, a smell of preservation. The hot liquid hisses slightly as it touches the dry bone. It is sealing the empty room of the mind. You can imagine the silence inside that skull now. The echoes of thoughts are gone, replaced by the solid, amber silence of the resin. It is a permanent shutdown. The embalmers then move to plug the nose. They don't want the resin leaking back out before it sets. They use small plugs of wax or rolled linen, sometimes adorned with small amulets. Even the nose, the exit route for the useless brain, gets a little spiritual protection. You can see the care they take in wiping the face clean, removing any stray drops of resin or blood. They treat the skin with oils, massaging it to keep it supple. The tenderness returns once the violent extraction is over. It is as if they are saying, "Sorry about that, but it had to be done." You feel a strange sense of peace watching this efficient destruction. There is no tragedy here, only purpose. They are not destroying the person. In their eyes, they are saving them. By removing the wet, corruptible brain, they are ensuring the body can last forever. They are prioritizing eternity over anatomy. You realize that to them, the brain was a liability. It was the weak link in the chain of immortality. It was the part of the body most likely to betray the whole by rotting first. So, getting rid of it was an act of preservation, a way of bulletproofing the mummy against the ravages of time. The sun outside the workshop is beginning to dip lower, casting long, golden beams through the high windows. The dust in the air turns to gold. The embalmers are finishing this stage of the work. The bodies are lined up, heads packed and sealed, waiting for the next step. You look at the row of silent faces. They look peaceful. They look ready. And you know, with a secret modern knowledge, that they are all empty, headed in the most literal sense. But in the warm glow of the Egyptian evening, it doesn't seem to matter. They have their hearts. They have their names. And soon, they will have their beautiful wrappings. The brain is gone, forgotten in the bucket. But the journey continues. You drift away from the table, leaving the bronze hooks and the resin pots behind. The air feels cooler now, as you move away from the heat of the active work. You are moving deeper into the understanding of this culture, past the physical mechanics and into the texts that tried to make sense of it all. You are leaving the butchers and heading toward the scribes. But the sound of that little crack of the ethmoid bone stays with you, a tiny, snapping reminder of how fragile our understanding of ourselves really is. You leave the warm, resin, scented air of the embalming workshop behind, stepping out of the harsh sunlight and into the cool, shadowed interior of the Ankh, the house of life. This is the library, the university, and the sacred archive all rolled into one. The air here is different. It does not smell of spices and salts. It smells of dry papyrus, carbon ink, and the quiet, accumulated dust of centuries. It is a space of hushed reverence, where the only sound is the faint scratching of a reed brush against a scroll or the soft rustle of linen as a scribe shifts his weight on a woven mat. You feel the temperature drop, a welcome relief from the desert heat, and you let your eyes adjust to the dim light filtering through high, narrow windows. You are here to look for the written proof, the medical receipt that explains what the Egyptians actually knew about the inside of the human head. It is one thing to see them discard a brain in a workshop. It is another to see what they wrote about it when they were trying to heal the living. You wander past rows of cubbies, stacked high with rolled scrolls, thousands of them, containing the collective wisdom of the empire. Astronomy, mathematics, temple rituals, and myths. But you are looking for something very specific, a text that is rare and precious. You are looking for what we now call the Edwin Smith Papyrus, though to the scribe sitting in the corner, it is simply the secret book of the physician. You find a quiet spot and imagine unrolling this fragile, yellowed document. It is long, stretching out across the low wooden table. The black and red ink stands out sharply against the fiber of the paper, This is not a book of spells or prayers to ward off demons. This is a trauma manual. It is a battlefield guide. It was written by someone who saw terrible injuries, likely from war or construction accidents, and had to deal with them practically. As you scan the columns of hieroglyphs, your finger traces the lines until you find it, the very first written reference to the word brain in human history. It looks like a small, unassuming group of symbols. It is the word A's. It includes a little determinative symbol at the end that looks like a pustule or a soft mass, indicating something squishy. It is humble. It does not have the grandeur of the symbol for heart, which often appears with the sign for life or divinity. This word, A's, is purely descriptive. It refers to the marrow of the skull. You stare at it, realizing you are looking at the moment humanity first named its own processor, yet failed to recognize it as the captain of the ship. The text you are reading is fascinatingly objective. It is organized into cases, starting from the head and moving down the body. You focus on case 6. This is the famous entry that describes a gaping wound in the head, a fracture of the skull that exposes the brain. The ancient surgeon describes probing the wound with his fingers. He writes that he feels something fluttering and throbbing beneath his fingertips, like the weak place of an infant's crown before it becomes whole. He is describing the pulsation of the cerebral cortex, the physical movement of the brain with the arterial pulse. He sees it, he touches it, he records it. You can almost feel the texture of that moment. The gritty sand of the battlefield, the pain of the patient, and the clinical curiosity of the doctor. He goes further. He describes the brain as having corrugations, like the ripples that form on molten copper as it cools. Or, like the slag of metal, it is a vivid industrial comparison. He is looking at the convolutions of the brain, the gyrri and sulci, and comparing them to the waste product of a smelting furnace. It is a brilliant observation, accurate and sharp, but notice the analogy. Slag is waste. It is the stuff you skim off and throw away to get to the pure metal. Even in his description, the metaphor implies something secondary, something less than precious. The text continues to describe the membranes wrapping the brain, which we know as the meninges. He notes that when the skull is smashed, this membrane can be torn. He is mapping the territory. But here is where the disconnect happens, the great pause in medical history that you are exploring tonight. He notices that when a man has this specific injury, a smash to the skull exposing the brain, he suffers from specific symptoms. The text says the patient shudders or has seizures. It says he might bleed from the nose or ears. It even notes that he might have a stiffness in his neck. There is a moment in case 8 where the surgeon notes that a blow to the skull causes the patient to walk with a shuffle or lose the ability to speak clearly. You might want to lean in here, because this is the closest they ever came to the truth. They saw the cause head smash. They saw the effect. Can't walk properly. You would think logic would dictate that they would connect the dots and say, "Ah!" The head controls the legs. But they didn't. They recorded the connection as a purely mechanical failure, like a broken chariot wheel causing the cart to tilt. They did not leap to the conclusion that the head commanded the legs. They just thought the trauma had disrupted the flow of the metu vessels or damaged the structural integrity of the body's frame. Historians still argue whether this specific author, whom some believe might have been the legendary architect and physician Imhotep, actually brilliantly understood the brain's importance, but lacked the vocabulary or the cultural authority to challenge the heart-centered dogma. Did he know? Did he suspect? Or was he simply a diligent observer recording data without a unifying theory? The text remains silent on his inner thoughts. It gives only the symptoms and the diagnosis, an ailment not to be treated. That is the grim verdict for severe brain injuries, if the skull was shattered and the brain exposed. The ancient prescription was usually just to make the patient comfortable until the end. You watch the imaginary dust motes dancing in the shaft of light falling on the papyrus. The script is beautiful, flowing from right to left. The ink, made of soot and gum, has held its color for millennia. You can see the red ink used for headings and the black for the main text. It is a work of art, this catalogue of pain. And in all these columns, the brain is mentioned only a handful of times, always in the context of, "This is broken." It is never mentioned in the context of, "This is where the patient dreams." The treatment for lesser head injuries, where the brain wasn't fully exposed, is also telling. The papyrus suggests binding the wound with fresh meat. You can imagine the sensation. A cool, raw steak strapped to a throbbing headache. It acted as a compress, reducing swelling and stopping bleeding. They also used honey, which we now know has antibacterial properties, and lint made from vegetable fiber to absorb fluids. It was practical, sensible field medicine, but none of the treatments involved prayers to a god of the brain. If you had a heart condition, you might wear an amulet. If you had a brain injury, you got a stake and a bandage. It was a physical problem, not a spiritual crisis. You scroll further through the text, looking for more clues. You find references to the sutures of the skull, the zigzag lines where the bone plates fuse. The Egyptians knew the anatomy of the bone container perfectly. They knew it was a helmet protecting something, but because that something didn't look like it did any work. It didn't pump. It didn't digest. It didn't breathe. They couldn't assign it a job. In a society where everyone had a role, from the pharaoh to the peasant, the brain was the only unemployed organ in the body. The silence of the brain in the rest of the medical corpus is deafening. You might look at other papyri, like the Ebers papyrus you thought of earlier. It lists hundreds of remedies for the stomach, the eyes, the anus, the toes. It has spells for banishing gray hair and recipes for curing baldness, a mixture of fats from a lion, a hippo, a crocodile, and a snake. Good luck collecting those. But for improving memory or curing sadness, the remedies are directed at the heart. If you were depressed, it was because your heart was heavy or your heart vessels were clogged. The physician would give you a draught to gladden the heart, not a pill to stimulate the brain. This disconnect is what makes the Edwin Smith papyrus so special and so frustrating. It is a flash of light in the dark. It shows that they saw everything. They had the pieces of the puzzle right there on the table. They saw the corrugations. They saw the pulsating. They saw the shuddering. But the cultural narrative of the heart was so loud, so overwhelming, that it drowned out the quiet evidence of the brain. It is like looking at a computer and thinking the cooling fan is the most important part because it makes the most noise and moves the fastest, while the silent chip underneath is ignored. You sit back on the reed mat, feeling the rough texture under your hands. The library is quiet. A scribe nearby dips his brush into his palette, the water turning black. He is copying a text, perhaps a hymn to Osiris. He believes, with every fiber of his being, that his skill in writing comes from his heart. He believes his hand is guided by the desires of his chest. You look at him and want to whisper, "It's your motor cortex. It's your parietal lobe." But you can't. You are just a ghost in his world. There is a quirky or fringe tidbit regarding the terminology. The ancient Egyptian language was rich and metaphorical. They had dozens of words for bread, for beer, for the different stages of the Nile flood. But the word for brain, is etymologically obscure. Some linguists suggest it might be related to words for viscera or general, soft stuff. It lacks the poetic weight of ib heart or by soul. It is a utility word. It is like the word for spleen or gallbladder. It doesn't sing. This linguistic limit likely reinforced the lack of interest. If you don't have a beautiful word for something, it's hard to write poetry about it. You also have to consider the role of the Sun, the physician. These men were often priests of Sekhmet, the lion, headed goddess of healing and plague. They walked a fine line between magic and medicine. When they treated a patient, they often recited spells while applying the bandage. For a head injury, the spell might ask for the bone to knit together, but it wouldn't ask for the mind to be restored, because the mind wasn't in the head. The mind was safe in the chest, presumably annoyed that the head was broken, but otherwise intact. This separation of hardware, head, and software, Sahat, meant that head trauma was seen as a structural issue, not a psychiatric one. Imagine the bedside manner of an ancient Egyptian doctor. Well, he might say, "Your skull is cracked, and you can't move your left arm. We will bind it with honey. Your heart is still beating strong, so you are still you. You just have a broken roof." It is a comforting thought, in a way. It implies that your essential self is protected deep in your torso, far away from the fragile, exposed head. It makes the soul harder to kill. You gaze up at the wooden shelves storing the scrolls. Thousands of years of knowledge. They knew how to align the pyramids with the stars. They knew how to perform cataract surgery on the eye. They knew how to make ice in the desert. But they looked at the brain, the very tool that allowed them to do all of that, and shrugged. It is the ultimate blind spot. It is the eye unable to see itself. As the afternoon wears on, the light in the library shifts, casting long, barred shadows across the floor. The scribes begin to pack up their tools. You feel the heavy, dry atmosphere of the room. It is a place of immense intelligence, yet it contains this one singular void. The Edwin Smith papyrus is rolled back up, its secrets hidden away again. The description of the copper slag ripples is covered by the yellow weave of the papyrus. The brain goes back to being anonymous. You feel a drowsiness settling in, a sympathetic response to the quiet of the library. It is a good place to rest. The smell of old paper is hypnotic. You realize that even though they were wrong about the brain, they were right about the care. They tended to the broken heads with gentleness. They tried. They observed. They wrote it down. And because they wrote it down, we know today that they were the first to touch the surface of the mind, even if they didn't realize what they were holding. The scroll is placed back in its cubby, nestled among the hymns. and the harvest records. It will sleep there in the dark. You prepare to leave the house of life, stepping back out toward the river, carrying with you the image of that ancient surgeon, standing over a wounded soldier, staring at the gray matter and wondering, just for a fleeting second, what it might be. But the heart beat in his chest, loud and reassuring, and the moment passed. The brain remained a mystery, waiting for a different age to wake it up. You step out of the house of life, and the sun has finally begun to set, casting a deep, burnished gold light across the Nile. The heat of the day is lifting, replaced by a violet twilight that feels heavy with magic. You have seen the physical reality, the discarded brain, the cherished heart, the medical texts that missed the mark. But now you must step into the invisible world to truly understand how the Egyptians solved the problem of the missing mind. If the brain was trash and the heart was a pump, where did the you actually live? Where was the personality, the humor, the specific way you like your tea? The answer lies not in biology, but in a beautiful, complex architecture of the soul that floated like smoke around the physical body. You find yourself walking toward the necropolis, the city of the dead on the west bank of the river. It is quiet here, but not empty. To the Egyptians, this place is bustling with unseen traffic. You are entering the realm of the Ba and the Kai, the spiritual entities that took over the job of consciousness when the body failed. You probably believe that you have one soul, a single spark inside you. But the Egyptians, true to their love of complex systems, believed you were a composite creature, a team of spiritual players that had to work together to keep you existing. And because the brain was out of the picture, these spirits had to do all the heavy lifting of thinking, remembering, and feeling. First, you encounter the concept of the Ka. Imagine a silent, invisible twin standing right next to you. This is your double. The Egyptians believe that when you were born, the ram-headed creator god Khnum fashioned your body on his potter's wheel, but he also fashioned your Kai. It is the vital spark, the difference between a living person and a corpse. It is the battery power of your existence. You can imagine the Kai as a static force. It doesn't wander around much. It sticks with the body. When you die, your Ka remains in the tomb, inhabiting your statues, waiting for you. This explains why the brain wasn't needed to run. The body in the afterlife. The Ka took over the metabolic functions. But the Ka was needy. It required food and drink. This is why you see those elaborate offering tables painted on tomb walls, piled high with bread, beer, onions, and roast duck. The brain doesn't need calories anymore, but the Kai is famished. You watch, in your mind's eye, a priest placing a loaf of bread before a statue. He doesn't expect the statue to chew it. He believes the Ka absorbs the Ka, the spiritual essence, of the bread. It is a transfer of energy that bypasses the digestive system entirely. The mind of the Kai is a survival mind, a consciousness focused on sustenance and presence. It anchors you to the spot. But a battery is not a person. A battery doesn't remember the smell of lotus flowers or the sound of your mother's voice. For that, the Egyptians had the Bu. You look up toward the sky, darkening now with the first stars, and you imagine a bird taking flight. This is the Bay. It is often depicted as a falcon with a human head, your head. This is the personality. This is the part of you that makes you unique. Since they threw away the frontal lobes, The bar became the repository of all your memories, your quirks, and your intellect. It was the mobile drive of your consciousness. The bar is the ultimate answer to the useless brain. Paradox. If the brain is removed, how do you travel to the afterlife? You fly. The bar was not trapped in the mummy. It had the power to leave the tomb during the day, to fly out into the world of the living, to revisit the places you loved, to watch your descendants, maybe even to enjoy the sunlight on the river. Then, at night, it had to return to the tomb to reunite with the decay and rest within the mummified body. The body was the home base, the roost for the bird's soul. This creates a comforting image. You are not locked in a dark box forever. You are free to roam, carried on the wings of your bar, while your physical shell rests safely wrapped in linen. The brain, that cold, wet sponge, couldn't fly. It was stuck in the skull. But the bar is weightless. It explains why the Egyptians didn't worry about the loss of the brain's processing power. They outsourced the processing to a spiritual bird that could transcend walls. You stand before one of the tomb entrances, tracing the carvings on the stone. You see a false door, a standard architectural feature in these resting places. It looks like a real door, with jambs and a lintel, but it is solid stone. There is no opening. To you, it is a wall. To the barn car, it is a portal. This is the interface between the worlds. The bar uses this door to swoop in and out. It is a magical threshold that requires no physical key, only the correct spiritual frequency. You can imagine the bar bird landing softly on the offering table, pecking at the spiritual bread, then hopping through the solid stone to cuddle up with the mummy for the night. There is a mainstream historical fact that underscores this intense need for the bar to recognize the body, the use of portrait masks. You recall the golden face of Tutankhamun or the colorful plaster faces on Roman-era mummies. These weren't just for decoration. They were GPS coordinates. Since the brain was gone, and the face underneath the bandages was dried and shrunken, the bar bird needed a clear image to know where to land. "That's me," the bar would say, spotting the gold mask. If the mask was lost or the face destroyed, the bar might get confused and become a lost spirit, a mutt, creating a terrible, wandering ghost. The mask was the beacon that guided the personality back to its shell. The complexity of this soul anatomy gets even deeper. You also had a shoot or shadow. You looked down at your feet, seeing your own shadow stretching long across the sand in the moonlight. To the Egyptians, a shadow wasn't just an absence of light. It was a silent companion, a black silhouette that contained a part of your essence. You couldn't exist without it. A person with no shadow does not exist. The shoot was another backup drive for identity. It was always there, quiet, dark, and faithful. Even if the body was damaged, the shadow remained as long as there was light. It suggests a view of the self that is scattered, distributed across different mediums: stone, flesh, bird, and shadow, rather than locked inside a single organ like the brain. And then there was the Ren, the name. This is perhaps the most poetic replacement for the brain's memory storage. To the Egyptians, your name was not just a label. It was a foundational stone of your existence. As long as your name was spoken, written, or remembered, you were alive. This is why they carved their names so deeply into the granite of their statues. This is why they were so terrified of having their names chiseled out by enemies. If your name was erased, the Ren died. and a huge chunk of your soul simply vanished. Memory was not a neural pathway. Memory was a social act. You lived because others remembered you. The brain of the society held your existence, not the tissue in your own head. Historians still argue about the precise relationship between the bay and the physical body during the person's life. Did the ba exist while you were breathing, or was it only born at the moment of death? Some scholars believe the ba was the manifestation of the person's power and presence. So a pharaoh had a huge ba while alive, but a commoner might only realize theirs after death. Others think it was always there, a dormant avian twin waiting for the cage of the body to open. It is a debate about the timing of the soul, but either way, it confirms that the self was independent of the gray matter. You wander deeper into the silence of the necropolis. The stars are bright now, the same stars the Egyptians used to align their pyramids. You feel the cool desert wind, the north wind, that they prayed to breathe in the afterlife. You realize that this system of Ka, Ba Shoot, and Ren was incredibly resilient. If you rely on your brain and you get a head injury, you lose yourself. But in the Egyptian system, if your body is hurt, your Ba is still flying. If your statue is broken, your name is still on the wall. If the wall is crumbled, your shadow is still on the sand. It is a cloud, computing version of the soul, with multiple backups in different locations. It is far more robust than the single point of failure we accept today in modern neurology. There is a quirky or fringe tidbit concerning the opening of the mouth ceremony. This was a ritual performed on the mummy Fs and statues just before burial. A priest would touch the mouth of the mummy with a special adze tool, magically restoring the ability to speak, eat, and breathe. But here is the strange part. They never performed an opening of the brain ceremony. They didn't touch the forehead and say, "Now you can think again." They restored the sensory inputs, mouth, eyes, ears, and the heart. But they never felt the need to jump, start the brain. They assumed that if the mouth could speak and the heart could beat, the thinking would just happen. The consciousness was an emergent property of the soul, not a mechanical output of the brain. You can imagine the scene of this ritual. The smell of incense, the chanting, the priest in his leopard skin robe. It is a moment of high magic. He touches the adze to the lips of the silent, wrapped figure. "You are young again," he might chant. "You live again." It is a touching attempt to reverse death. But it highlights the gap in their medical knowledge. They thought they were rebooting the system, but they were ignoring the CPU. They were polishing the monitor and fixing the speakers, but the tower was empty. Yet, in their faith, it worked. The Ba heard the call and came fluttering down. This belief system also reshaped how they viewed sleep. You are lying in your bed now, perhaps feeling that heavy, pleasant drift of oncoming sleep. To the ancient Egyptians, sleep was not just a metabolic recharge, it was a practice run for death. They believed that when you slept, your ba might stretch its wings and wander a little, exploring the dream world. Dreams were not random neuron firings, they were actual journeys taken by the soul. If you saw a god in a dream, you had actually visited them. If you saw a dead relative, your Ba had actually met their Ba. This made the night a time of activity and travel, not just distinct oblivion. It gave the sleeping mind a validity and a reality that modern science often dismisses. The atmosphere in the Valley of the Kings is heavy with this sleeping energy. You can feel the presence of thousands of bars resting in their tombs, waiting for the sun to rise so they can fly out again. The silence is not empty, it is pregnant with waiting. You realize that for them, the afterlife was not a ghostly, ethereal realm of clouds. It was a mirror of Egypt, the field of reeds, where you plowed the fields, drank beer, and sat in the shade of sycamore trees. It was a physical paradise that required a physical body. And because the Ba and Ka handled the consciousness, you could enjoy this paradise without needing the contents of your skull. You could enjoy the eternal sunshine with a head full of resin and linen. You sit for a moment on a stone block, resting your legs. The desert is vast and open around you. You think about the comfort of this worldview. It removes the pressure of being smart or intellectual. Your worth wasn't determined by your IQ or your ability to solve puzzles, functions we associate with the brain. Your worth was determined by the weight of your heart, your morality, and the strength of your preparations. Tell your tomb and offerings. It was a moral and ritual test, not a cognitive one. You didn't have to be a genius to get into heaven. You just had to be a good person and have a good embalmer. As you look at the paintings on the tomb walls, scenes of hunting in the marshes, of feasts, of harvest, you see the Ba birds often depicted perched in the corners, watching the scenes. They are the witnesses. They are the continuity. The artist who painted them knew that the body would decay, that the brain had been thrown in the trash, but the Ba would remain. The bird was the promise that nothing was truly lost. The night deepens, and the temperature drops further. You wrap your arms around yourself, feeling the solidity of your own body. You are grateful for your brain, surely, for the way it processes the cool air and the starlight. But there is a part of you that envies the Egyptians their birds. It is a beautiful idea that your personality is a winged creature that can never be trapped, never be destroyed, and never be fully silenced. Even if the skull is empty, the bird still sings. You prepare to leave the necropolis, stepping back toward the river where the boat waits. You are leaving the land of the Ba and returning to the land of the living history. The Egyptians held on to this belief for 3,000 years. It worked for them. It explained everything they needed to know about life, death, and the self. They didn't need neurons when they had magic. They didn't need synapses when they had the sun. But across the sea, in a land of islands and olive trees, different questions were starting to be asked. Men with beards and questions were beginning to poke at the world with logic instead of ritual. And they were starting to look at the head with a different kind of curiosity. You gently drift away from the warm, golden sands of the Nile Valley, leaving behind the silent tombs and the soaring pyramids, the heavy scent of myrrh, and the rhythmic chant of the priests fade into the distance, as you find yourself carried by a different wind, a salty, fresh breeze moving across the deep blue expanse of the Mediterranean Sea. You are traveling forward in time and northward in space, landing softly on the rocky, sun-drenched coast of ancient Greece. Here, the light feels different, sharper, clearer, bouncing off white marble and olive trees. You have left the land of timeless ritual and entered the land of restless questions. You find yourself walking through the agora of a bustling city, perhaps Athens or Corinth. The atmosphere is less about preserving the dead and more about arguing with the living. Men in linen tunics stand in the shade of colonnades, debating the nature of the universe, the soul, and the body. You can hear the low hum of their voices, a gentle murmur of logic and reason that acts as a lullaby for the afternoon. In Egypt, the heart was the undisputed king, seated on a throne of tradition. Here in Greece, the heart is facing a challenger. A coup is brewing in the world of anatomy, and the usurper is that wet, gray lump in the skull. You wander into the study of a man named Alcmaeon of Croton. It is early, perhaps the 5th century BCE. The room is simple, filled with the smell of dried herbs and the metallic tang of instruments. Alcmaeon is not a priest, he is a natural philosopher. He is not afraid to look inside. You watch as he performs a dissection, not on a human, for that is still largely taboo here, but on an animal. He traces the path of the nerves. He looks at the eye of the creature and follows the optic nerve back, until it disappears not into the chest, but into the skull. This is a quiet, thunderous moment. For thousands of years, the world believed the eyes sent messages to the heart. Alcmaeon looks at the physical evidence and shakes his head. The channels, or poros, clearly lead to the brain. He is the first to suggest that the brain is the seat of the senses. You can imagine the skepticism he faced. The brain, his friends might have asked, sipping their watered wine. That cold porridge. Surely you are joking. The heart is where the heat is. But Alcmaeon had seen the wiring. He had traced the cables. He opened the door a crack, letting a sliver of light fall on the true master of the house. As you move through the centuries, the debate grows louder. You arrive at the feet of Hippocrates, the man history would later call the father of medicine. He sits under a plane tree on the island of Kos, the leaves rustling softly in the wind. He is writing a text that will survive for millennia, a text called On the Sacred Disease. The disease is epilepsy, which most people at the time believed was a curse from the gods, a possession that required exorcism. Hippocrates looks at the seizing patient and sees something else. He sees a malfunction of the organ in the head. You lean over his shoulder, ghostly and unseen, and read the words he scratches onto the wax tablet. Men ought to know that from nothing else but the brain come joys, delights, laughter and sports, and sorrows, griefs, despondency, and lamentations. It is a radical, beautiful declaration. He is stealing the entire emotional spectrum from the heart and giving it to the brain. He continues, and by this, in an especial manner, we acquire wisdom and knowledge, and see and hear. It is the first time in your journey that you hear someone give the brain its due credit. You feel a sense of relief, of validation. Finally, someone figured it out. However, do not get too comfortable with this victory. The path to truth is never a straight line. It is a winding, sleepy road full of detours. Just as the brain was gaining ground, a giant stepped onto the stage to push it back down. You travel to the Lyceum in Athens, the school of Aristotle. He is walking through the gardens, lecturing to his students. Aristotle is a genius, a master of logic, biology, and ethics. He observes everything. He catalogues everything. And he is completely, confidently wrong about the brain. You listen to his argument, and it is fascinatingly logical, even if it is incorrect. Aristotle is a champion of the heart. He observes the embryo of a chick and sees the heart beating first, long before the brain develops. He notes that all living creatures have a heart, or something like it. But only higher animals have a large brain. He touches the brain of a dissected animal and finds it cold and bloodless. Since the blood drains out after death, he touches the heart and finds it warm and full of blood. To him, heat is life. Therefore, the heart must be the furnace of the soul, the arche, the source of all movement and sensation. So, what does he think the brain does? You might chuckle softly at this. Aristotle proposes that the brain is a radiator. He believes the heart produces so much heat from all that passionate thinking and living that the body needs a cooling system to prevent it from burning up. The brain, being cold, wet, and watery, is the perfect air conditioning unit. The blood rushes up to the head, gets cooled down by the spongy brain, and then flows back down to the body, refreshed. This, he argues, is why humans are the most rational animals. We have the biggest brains, which means we have the best cooling systems, allowing us to have cooler, calmer blood, which leads to rational thought. Hot blood meant you were impulsive, cool blood meant you were wise. It is a radiator theory of neuroscience. You look at the marble bust of Aristotle and want to tell him, you were so close, yet so far. But his influence is massive. Because he is Aristotle, his view casts a long shadow. For centuries, people will nod and say, yes, the brain cools the blood. That makes sense. It effectively stalled the promotion of the brain, keeping it in the role of a support appliance rather than the CEO. There is a quirky or fringe tidbit related to Aristotle's observations. He also argued that the brain was unconnected to the sensory organs, because if you touched the brain of a living animal as, in the rare cases where this was possible, the animal felt no pain. He was right about the fact. The brain itself has no pain receptors. You can poke a brain and the patient won't feel it. But he drew the wrong conclusion. He assumed that because the brain couldn't feel a touch, it couldn't be responsible for feeling anything. It was a logical trap. The organ that processes pain is the only organ that cannot feel pain. It is the kind of paradox that kept the ancients scratching their heads in the olive groves. Historians still argue whether Aristotle's dismissal of the brain was a step backward or a necessary step sideways. His emphasis on comparative anatomy, looking at different animals to understand humans, was revolutionary. He noticed that the brain was compounded of earth and water, a vivid description of its texture. Even though he assigned it the wrong job, he paid attention to its structure. He was wrong for the right reasons, using observation and logic rather than just tradition. It was a productive error that forced later scientists to work harder to prove him wrong. You leave the Lyceum and let the timeline slip forward again, moving across the sea to the city of Alexandria in Egypt. This is where the two worlds collide. The ancient Egyptian tradition of preserving bodies and the Greek tradition of asking questions. In the dusty, scroll-filled halls of the great library, and in the anatomical theaters nearby, the next great leap happens. You are entering the era of Herophilus and Erasistratus, the butchers of Alexandria. The atmosphere here is a mix of the intellectual and the macabre. Unlike in classical Greece, where cutting a human body was forbidden, the Ptolemaic rulers of Egypt allowed, and perhaps encouraged, the dissection of executed criminals. You stand in the shadows of a stone room, watching Herophilus at work. He is not using a hook to pull the brain out through the nose. He is carefully surgically removing the top of the skull to see the brain in its natural habitat. He sees the calamus scriptorius, a groove in the brainstem that looks like a reed pen. He names the torcular herophyli, the meeting place of the sinuses at the back of the head. He traces the nerves from the brain to the muscles and distinguishes them from the tendons. He realizes that the nerves are not hollow tubes for air, but solid cords for transmission. He looks at the ventricles, the empty spaces inside the brain, and decides that the pneuma, the spirit or soul substance, must live there. This is a massive shift. You can feel the tension in the room as the old heart-centric model begins to crumble under the weight of physical evidence. Herophilus declares that the brain is the seat of the intellect, the center of the nervous system. He vindicates Hippocrates. He proves Alcmaeon right. You might feel a sense of triumph, thinking, finally we are there. But history is sticky. The old ideas cling like burrs to a woolen cloak. Even with this proof, the heart is king. Idea remained popular among the poets, the philosophers, and the common people. It is hard to unlearn a metaphor that feels so true in your chest. The debate continues to swirl around you as you walk through the colonnades of Alexandria. You hear scholars arguing about the rete mirabile, or the miraculous net. This was a network of blood vessels found at the base of the brain in some animals, like sheep and oxen. The ancients believed this net refined the spirit, turning the rough, vital spirit from the heart into the noble, animal spirit of the brain. The funny thing is, humans don't have this net. But because they dissected animals and assumed humans were the same, they invented a piece of anatomy that didn't exist in us, just to explain how the brain got its power. It was a phantom structure, a ghost in the machine, created to bridge the gap between their theories and their observations. You pause by a fountain, the sound of trickling water reminding you of Aristotle's cooling theory. It is peaceful here. You realize that this era was a time of beautiful confusion. They were mapping a continent they couldn't truly see. They were like cartographers drawing the coastline of a new world, getting the shape roughly right, but filling the interior with sea monsters and radiators. One of the most soothing aspects of the Greek view, specifically Plato's, was the idea of the tripartite soul. Plato, the teacher of Aristotle, had a different take. He believed the soul had three parts: the logical, the spirited, and the appetitive. The appetites food, sex lived in the belly. The spirit, else courage, angered, lived in the chest-heart. But the logic, the divine, immortal part of you, lived in the head. Why? Because the head is a sphere, and the sphere is the perfect geometric shape in the universe. Therefore, the perfect part of the soul must live in the perfect container. It wasn't medical science, it was geometry. But it put the brain back on top. You can imagine Plato walking in the academy, pointing to his head and saying, "This is my little universe." It creates a sense of detachment, a cozy separation between your thinking self and your feeling self. When you are stressed or angry, that's just your chest acting up. Your head is a floating sphere of pure reason, or at least it's supposed to be. The legacy of these Greek debates is woven into the very language we use today. When you say you are melancholy, you are using the Greek word for black bile, a humor they believed affected the brain. When you say you are phlegmatic, chiam, you are referring to phlegm, which they thought originated in the brain because it dripped down into the nose. You are speaking the language of Hippocrates and Galen without even knowing it. The ghosts of these ancient arguments are haunting your vocabulary. As the sun begins to dip into the Aegean, painting the white marble columns with hues of pink and orange, you feel the weight of this intellectual journey. You have seen the brain go from being a piece of trash in Egypt to a cooling device in Athens, to a divine sphere in the academy, to a complex machine in Alexandria. It has been insulted, misunderstood, promoted, and demoted. It has been poked, prodded, and dissolved. And through it all, it kept doing its job, silently allowing these men to think the thoughts that misunderstood it. The Romans would later come along and inherit this mess of contradictions. Galen, the great Roman physician, would take up the mantle of Herophilus and fight the Aristotle loyalists, screaming at them to look at the nerves, to look at the brain. He would perform public demonstrations, severing the nerves of squealing pigs to show that the voice came from the brain, not the heart. But even then, the heart remained the poetic favorite. You sit on the steps of an ancient library, watching the scholars roll up their scrolls for the evening. The air cools down, the radiator of the night turning on. You realize that the brain's journey to recognition was not a sprint. It was a slow, meandering walk through centuries of guesswork. It is comforting to know that we don't have to have all the answers right away. The Greeks didn't. They argued, they guessed, they made up radiator theories, and the world kept turning. The silence of the evening settles over Greece. The debates in the agora have ended. The dissections are finished. The philosophers are asleep, their brains, zevzes, and hearts resting. You feel a kinship with them. You are also trying to understand yourself, trying to figure out where your thoughts come from and where they go. The ancient oversight regarding the brain is not just a funny historical mistake. It is a testament to how mysterious we are to ourselves. We are looking in the mirror and not recognizing the glass. As you prepare to leave this era, you look back at the bust of Aristotle one last time. He looks serious, contemplative. He was wrong about the brain, but he taught us how to think. And in a way, his cooling theory isn't entirely bad. Tonight, you want your brain to be a cooling mechanism. You want it to cool down your hot thoughts, to soothe your worries, to lower the temperature of your mind so you can drift into sleep. You want to be a little bit Aristotelian. You want to be cool, calm, and bloodless in the best possible way. The wind shifts again, carrying you away from the olive groves and the marble steps. You are drifting toward the final leg of your journey, toward the realization of what this all means for us, the modern sleepers. The ancient world is fading, its debates turning into whispers, its certainties turning into dust. But the brain remains, the silent, pulsating mystery in the dark, waiting for its final close-up. You drift forward now, carried on the slow, heavy current of time. The bright, sharp sunlight of the Mediterranean fades into the mellow, amber glow of a candlelit study in a high stone tower. You have left the ancient sands and the marble agoras behind, entering the quiet, dusty expanse of the Middle Ages and the awakening of the Renaissance. It is a time of parchment, of quill pens scratching in the silence, and of a slow, stubborn realization that perhaps the Egyptians were wrong about the luggage they threw away. But old habits, especially those of the heart, die very hard. You observe the persistence of the Egyptian view in the very language of the scholars who claim to have moved past it. Even as anatomists in the 1500s begin to peel back the layers of the scalp with unparalleled precision, the heart refuses to abdicate its throne. You see it in the poetry, the prayers, and the casual speech of the people. When a man of this era pledges his truth, he places a hand on his chest, not his forehead. When he memorizes a psalm, he learns it by heart, a direct linguistic fossil from the Nile Valley. The brain is gaining ground in the textbooks, but the heart still rules the culture. It is the stubborn incumbent that simply won't leave the office. You find yourself standing in the shadows of an anatomy theater in Padua or Bologna. The room is circular, tiered with wooden benches, filled with students in heavy robes, their breath visible in the chill air. In the center, illuminated by a chandelier of tallow candles, lies a body. The anatomist, perhaps the great Andreas Vesalius himself, is at work. He is not using a bronze hook. He is using fine steel scalpels. He lifts the top of the skull, the calvarium, like the lid of a jar. For the first time, the brain is truly the star of the show. You watch the students lean in, their eyes wide. They see the two hemispheres, looking like a grand walnut meat. They see the intricate web of veins. Vesalius traces the nerves, proving once and for all that they originate here, not in the chest. He sketches them with the eye of an artist, creating maps of the human interior that are as beautiful as they are gruesome. You feel a sense of vindication for the silent organ. Finally, it is being admired. It is being drawn. It is being taken seriously. Yet, even here, there is confusion. You notice that while they map the geography of the brain, they are still lost regarding its function. They came up with the cell doctrine, or ventricular theory. You look at a drawing on a nearby table. It shows the brain containing 3 distinct empty spaces, or cells. They believed the first cell was for imagination, the second for reason, and the third for memory. It was a simple 3-room apartment model of the mind. They thought the spirit flowed from room to room, like a drafty breeze. It was an attempt to impose order on the gray mush, to give it an architecture that matched their theology. They couldn't just accept that the tissue itself did the thinking. They needed the empty spaces, the air, inside, to be the magic. It was a lingering echo of the Egyptian breath of life. There is a mainstream historical fact that anchors this transition, the work of Thomas Willis in the 17th century. He is often called the father of neurology. He coined the term neurology. You watch him in his Oxford study, dissecting brains not just of humans, but of sheep and dogs, comparing them. He identifies the circle of Willis, the loop of arteries at the base of the brain that ensures it keeps getting blood, even if one line is blocked. He realized the brain was so important that nature built a backup generator for its fuel supply. Willis looked at the substance of the brain, the cortex, and boldly claimed that this was where the memories were stored, not in the empty air of the ventricles. He moved the ghost out of the attic and into the walls. But here is a quirky, slightly macabre tidbit that shows just how confused this era still was. While scientists were elevating the brain, the general public, and even royalty, were consuming the wisdom of Egypt in the worst possible way. They were eating mumia. That's right. For centuries, ground up ancient Egyptian mummies was sold in European apothecaries as a cure, all medicine. You could buy a jar of brown powder that used to be a person. Ironically, they believed the ancient bitumen and resins used in embalming had magical healing properties. They would take a pinch of mummy powder to cure headaches, stomach aches, or bruises. Think about the layers of irony here. The Egyptians threw away the brain because they thought it was useless. Thousands of years later, Europeans, who were starting to value the brain, were eating the bodies of those very Egyptians to fix their own heads. They were consuming the shell to treat the contents. It speaks to a deep, desperate human need to find magic in the past, to believe that death can cure life. You can imagine the taste, dusty, bitter, old, and the strange, circular journey of those ancient bodies, traveling from the embalming table to the apothecary jar, never suspecting they would end up as a headache cure for a French merchant. As the scientific revolution gathers pace, you witness the final battle for the soul. It moves from the heart to a tiny, specific spot in the brain. You stand behind the chair of the French philosopher René Descartes. He is staring into a fire, deep in thought. He is a dualist. He believes the mind and the body are separate things. But they have to touch somewhere. He needs a connection point, a joystick where the soul drives the meat machine. He chooses the pineal gland. Why? Because it is the only part of the brain that isn't doubled. Everything else has a left and a right side. The pineal gland sits right in the middle, a tiny, pine cone-shaped singularity. To Descartes, this geometric uniqueness was proof. He declared it the seat of the soul. You might smile at this. The Egyptians weighed the heart. Descartes pinpointed a gland the size of a grain of rice. It was still a search for a physical throne for the ghost. He couldn't accept that the whole brain was the pilot. He wanted a cockpit. Historians still argue whether this shift to cephalocentrism, centeredness, was a purely scientific evolution or a cultural one driven by the rise of individualism. Did we start valuing the brain because we discovered neurons, or did we look for neurons because we started valuing the individual? I, that lives in the head. In the Middle Ages, the community and the heart were central. In the modern age, the individual thinker became the hero. I think, therefore I am, said Descartes. He didn't say, I feel, therefore I am. The brain became the organ of the ego. You drift into the 19th century, the era of top hats and steam engines. The brain is now fully acknowledged as the command center, but it is still misunderstood. You see the rise of phrenology. People are running their fingers over skulls, feeling for bumps. They believe that if you have a bump here, you are generous, a bump there, and you are a thief. It is a parlor game masquerading as science. You watch a Victorian gentleman having his head measured with calipers, nodding solemnly as the phrenologist tells him he has a highly developed organ of destructiveness. It is nonsense, of course, but it shows the obsession. We went from ignoring the head to analyzing the packaging. We were desperately trying to read the label on the box without opening it. Then comes the true turning point. The quiet, tragic case of Phineas Gage. You might know the story. He was a railroad foreman in Vermont, 1848. An explosion drove a tamping iron, a giant metal rod, straight through his skull, destroying his left frontal lobe. He survived. He walked. He talked. He worked. But he wasn't Phineas anymore. His friends said Gage was no longer Gage. He became fitful, irreverent, profane. You stand invisibly on that railroad track, looking at the man holding his head. This moment proved what the Egyptians denied. The brain wasn't just a motor driver. It was the personality. It was the character. It was the soul. When the brain changed, the person changed. The heart kept beating the same steady rhythm, but the man was different. This was the final nail in the coffin of the heart. Soul theory. The you is the gray matter. If the matter is damaged, the you is altered. It is a terrifying, beautiful realization of our fragility. As you move into the modern era, the mystery doesn't vanish, it just deepens. You enter a modern hospital, quiet and sterile. You see the MRI machines, the great white donuts that see through bone. We can now watch the brain think. We can see the blood flow to the visual cortex when you look at a picture. We can see the amygdala light up when you are afraid. We have mapped the territory in a way the ancient scribes could never have dreamed. But think about the Egyptian legacy one last time. We know the brain does the math, the memory, and the logic. But when you really feel something, when you look at your sleeping child, or remember a lost love, or feel the swell of music, you still touch your chest. You don't touch your head. The Egyptians were wrong about the anatomy, but they were right about the sensation. The heart is still the user interface for our emotions. We live in a brain-centered world, but we experience it through a heart-centered simulation. We are biological machines that insist on being poets. You feel a sense of profound peace settling over you as you realize the journey is complete. You have traveled from the hot sand, where the brain was hooked out as trash, to the cool laboratories where it is revered as the most complex object in the universe. The brain has gone from zero to hero, from sludge to superstar, and yet it remains silent. It doesn't have a heartbeat. It doesn't have a voice. It just hums along, creating your reality, weaving your dreams, letting you hear this story. The legacy of the lost lobe is that it took us 5,000 years to find ourselves. We were looking down when we should have been looking up. We were listening to the drum when we should have been listening to the whisper. But now we know. You are your brain. You are that wrinkly, marvelous, electric coral reef floating in the dark ocean of your skull. And right now, that brain is getting tired. It has processed a lot of history. It has watched empires rise and fall, seen bodies wrapped in linen and dissected on tables. It is ready to do what it does best: shut down the outer world and open the inner one. The lights of the history tour are dimming. The library is closing. The anatomy theater is empty. The desert is silent. You are just you again, lying in your bed, safe in the 21st century. Your heart is beating slowly, a faithful engine. Your brain is slowing its waves, moving from the sharp beta of the day to the rolling alpha and theta of the night. The two organs, once rivals in history, are now partners in your rest. The heart pumps the warm blood. The brain paints the cool dreams. They work together in the dark, keeping you alive, keeping you you. You take a deep breath, feeling the air fill your lungs, that same breath of life. The ancients worshipped. You let it out, a long, slow exhale. The questions are answered. The arguments are over. There is nothing left to analyze. There is only the comfort of the pillow, the weight of the blanket, and the knowledge that your brain, that ancient, misunderstood masterpiece, is going to take care of you through the night. It knows what to do. It has always known, even when we didn't give it credit. It is the silent guardian, the watcher in the tower, and it is ready to lower the drawbridge and let you sleep. The journey is over now. The great river Nile has slowed to a stillness, its waters turning to glass under the moonlight. The dust of the desert has settled, covering the footprints of the embalmers, the priests, and the philosophers. All those busy hands, all those arguing voices, have faded into the soft, velvet silence of history. They are at rest, and now so are you. You can feel the timeline dissolving, the centuries melting away until there is only this moment, right here, right now. The room around you is safe and familiar. The shadows are just shadows, soft and still. You feel the gentle gravity holding you, anchoring you to your bed, just as the earth held the pyramids. There is no more work to be done, no more facts to remember, no more mysteries to solve. The books are closed, the scrolls are rolled up, the tools are put away. Let your focus drift inward to the quiet space behind your eyes. Imagine a soft, warm light there, glowing gently. It is the light of your own mind, dimmed down low for the night. It is a peaceful place, a sanctuary where the noise of the day cannot reach. You feel your muscles loosening, unspooling like a ribbon. Your jaw relaxes, your shoulders drop, your hands lie open and still. Listen to the rhythm of your own breathing, in and out, slow and steady. It is the oldest rhythm in the world, the tide of your own life. Let it rock you. Let it carry you away from the shore, drifting out into the deep, calm ocean of sleep. The water is warm, the stars are above you. You are weightless. You are free. The brain, that silent traveler, is turning off the lights in the house, one by one. The thoughts are becoming whispers, and the whispers are becoming silence. You are safe in the dark. You are whole. You are ready to drift. Sleep is coming now, soft and heavy, like a warm blanket pulled up to your chin. Close your eyes. Let go.